Welcome to the Darkstream, Vox Day, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. Let me get the chat set up here. We've got the unauthorized chat going. We've got the DLive chat going. And audio and video are good. Super chats are active. We are good to go. So, a couple of announcements before we get into it. First of all, today, marks the end of Something Big. So after 80 episodes, Something Big is at last. The story is complete. Thanks to Chuck Dixon, the legend, and Frank Fosco. They put this together. This was rolling from July 2021. 80 weeks. It's good stuff, big story, and definitely, if you haven't ever checked it out, you probably should do so one of these days. So, anyhow, it's kind of a big moment for Arkhaven in that, we to see a comic go from conception to closure. It's the first time I think that's truly happened on the site, rather than getting interrupted or going on hiatus or anything like that. So anyhow, kind of a big hallmark moment for us. So Something Big has come to the end of its run. Also, for those of you who are waiting for books, whether they're Castalia Library books or whether they're regular Castalia House books, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a bit longer. Our very clever plan to set up our own shipping center and everything has run into a snag in that the individual who's running it is unfortunately temporarily incapacitated, and so we're actually looking for someone to step in and help out for a period of time there until we can come up with a more stable long-term solution. So anyhow, that's what's going on. We will keep you posted, obviously. It won't have any effect in terms of eventually getting your books, but I think that the Conan books were the last ones to actually get out. Jungle Books has not, I don't think, even begun to ship yet. We're still trying to figure out exactly when the last shipments were sent out, but we'll keep everybody posted on that. And it would probably be a good thing to pray for the individual involved. So some of you know who it is, and he's a good guy. And obviously the timing's unfortunate, but I talked to him today and told him, look, just don't worry about it. We'll figure something out. So the ride never ends. And so Woke Bear says, we do fulfillment. I appreciate that. The problem is that we have, lots of books at the center already. So we need to, it needs to be done. It needs to be done there. And so, although, down the road, we'll see. Anyhow, one step at a time. This is not the first obstacle we faced. It won't be the last one, but we just keep moving forward. So let's get on to the topic then. The topic is neocons tending the garden. And for those of you who are not aware of what I'm referring to, it's a book called something about the jungle. What's the exact title of it again? It's by Robert Kagan. and the jungle grows back. And the reason that I picked it up was because Kagan is the husband of Victoria Nuland. She's the notorious neocon who travels around the world advocating democracy. What she actually is somebody who is responsible for helping launch coups in various countries. She was famously involved with the 2014 Ukrainian coup, and she was kind of notorious because somebody asked her about, well, what did the European Union and the European countries think, and she rather famously said, "Fuck the Europeans." So totally unconcerned about America's allies. Well, she obviously didn't kill Erdogan because Erdogan is alive. So, but she is almost certainly involved with the current color revolution in Sudan. In fact, I chronicled this here. Somebody had this. Yeah, that's the Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, and then now Victoria Nuland's visiting Sudan. Here's the time frame: August 24th, 2022. The first U.S. ambassador is appointed to Sudan in 25 years. September 28th, the U.S. warns Sudan against finalizing a deal for a Russian naval base. November 11th, Secretary of State Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, urges Sudan to consider U.S. support for the rapid formation of a civilian-led transitional government. December 5th, UN brokers the framework agreement between Sudan's military leaders and leading pro-democracy parties. Yeah, guess who's funding the latter? December 7th, Blinken threatens a travel ban for Sudanese who endanger framework agreement deal. Yeah, they're defending democracy here, you see. February 12th, Sudan confirms its deal for the Russian naval base. The key players are Russian Ambassador Lavrov and Sudan's General Burhan, who is he's probably the more powerful of the Sudanese generals. February 16th, the Biden administration sends $218 million in humanitarian aid to Sudan. In other words, the CIA sends the cash for the coup. March 9th, coup plans finalized. Orders are given as Victoria Nuland visits Sudan to discuss democracy. April 8th, conflict escalates between Sudanese armed forces under General Burhan and the paramilitary group RSF under Dagalo. Guess which one is being funded by this humanitarian aid? April 22nd, U.S. diplomats evacuate Sudan. April 24th, President Biden submits a war powers resolution to Congress regarding the deployment of U.S. military forces to Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And April 25th, it was reported that U.S. has moved intelligence assets and troops into Africa. And so, this is just another typical Neoclown attempt to enact a color revolution and force regime change, in this particular case because the Sudanese have allowed Russia to establish a naval base in Africa. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to overthrow the government because they don't want a pro-Russian government with access to the ocean there. It's probably going to fail because, number one, people are understanding that the U.S. doesn't have the abilities that it used to have. And it's been kind of fascinating to read. After I read that, I thought, I need to read some of these. I need to read some of these, neocon books, because I read some of their stuff back in the late '80s, early '90s. I actually used to read Commentary magazine quite a bit, and obviously my politics were quite a bit different then. I wasn't a neocon myself, but I didn't realize how pernicious they were at the time. So what's interesting about reading this book is, number one, the nature of the book makes it very clear the way that the neocons see themselves. I mean, the mere fact that it's called "The Jungle Grows Back," what Kagan is referring to there is they view the liberal world order, with the U.S. at the fore, as basically being the vanguard of humanity, and the liberal world order, or neoliberal world order as Kissinger calls it, is the garden, and the rest of the world is the jungle. And so I noted a few of the, highlighted some interesting stuff here. And so it's interesting to see how they view things. So now, this is one of the most deceitful books I've ever read, because it talks a lot about things that are true, and then it completely leaves out the deeper and more significant aspects. So it's just talking about the superficials incessantly. So it says, the American-led liberal world order was never a natural phenomenon. It was not the culmination of evolutionary processes across the millennia, or the inevitable fulfillment of universal human desires. The past 7+ decades of relatively free trade, growing respect for individual rights, and relatively peaceful cooperation among the nations, the core elements of the liberal order, have been a great historical aberration. That's true. Until 1945, the story of humankind going back thousands of years was a long tale of war, tyranny, and poverty. Okay, that until 1945? Really? That seems a bit questionable. But the point is that they really see that they do understand that the new or the liberal order is not guaranteed. They understand that it's not inevitable. This is definitely post-Fukuyama neoconnery. So they're not trying to argue anymore that their victory is inevitable. They're trying to change the perception so that instead of, you have to do what we say, our victory is inevitable. Now they're saying, well, we're the gardeners, and without our constant care, the jungle is going to grow back. Now, it's interesting because this is really, in some respects, a book by a neoclown for less strategic neoclowns. He says, unfortunately, or here we go, all of this has been an anomaly in the history of human existence. The liberal world order is fragile and impermanent. Now think about that compared to the end of history. Right? Like a garden, it is ever under siege from the natural forces of history, the jungle whose vines and weeds constantly threaten to overwhelm it. Unfortunately, we tend to take our world for granted. We have lived so long inside the bubble of the liberal world order, we can imagine no other kind of world. We think it is natural and normal, even inevitable. As children of the Enlightenment, We believe the expansion of knowledge and material progress goes hand in hand with improvements in human behavior and moral progress. And that's complete nonsense, right? We know it's complete nonsense now. Dun, 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 dun. From Hegel, we learn that history is but the progress of the consciousness of freedom, and that, as Francis Fukuyama put it in his famous description of the end of history, there is a common evolutionary pattern for all societies, something like a universal history of mankind in the direction of liberal democracy. Hence, we have come to believe that, while there may be occasional bumps and detours on the road, progress is inevitable. However, then he turns around and says, this is a myth. This is wrong. The perception rests on a carefully curated set of facts. And it is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And, it's interesting because he cites all the usual suspects. Here he even cites Steven Pinker. I mean, it's amazing how he cites Jew after Jew after Jew, but never once mentions anything about them, or that there might be any unifying purpose behind these beliefs. Steven Pinker, who documents the decline of violence in the world since 1945, argues that the reason this happened in such a short span of time was that the arguments that slew them belonged to the coherent philosophy that emerged during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. It's absurd. We're supposed to believe that people have changed because the arguments are so good. I mean, this is the core belief of the kind of people like Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris who think it's so important that we're having these conversations. It's all about talk. It's all about words. It's all about just constantly massaging what people can see. Houghton says the tactic of debunking one claim only to promote his own falsehoods sounds familiar, right? This is not something new. Now, this is what's kind of a fascinating admission. What we liberals call progress has been made possible by the protection afforded liberalism within the geographical and geopolitical space created by American power. That's true. This was not the inevitable unfolding of some universal history. That's also true. On the contrary, the creation of the liberal order has been an act of defiance against both history and human nature. That's absolutely and utterly true. But what does he leave out? He leaves out the most important thing. The creation of the liberal order has been an act of defiance against God and Jesus Christ. That's the whole element that's left out of this. And that's also the element, the reason he doesn't talk about that is because that's the element that most people don't admit. That's the element of which most people have not been aware, since the John Birchers were defeated by William F. Buckley for the soul of the conservative movement. What William F. Buckley converted the conservative movement into was an Enlightenment faction supporting the liberal world order. That's why the neocons back in the 90s were Republicans. People were astonished when they held on to their power under Obama. Now, everybody's used to it. Everybody understands that the Biden administration is a neoclown administration. But that wasn't supposed to be that way. And then he says, the question is not what will bring down the liberal order, but what can possibly hold it up. See, this was written in 2019, so they were already beginning to grasp that they were in trouble. I think that they knew that they were in trouble by 2015. I want to read two of his other books, his earlier books, so I can see um, what um, when they began to perceive that the history had not ended and that they needed to switch to the garden, the jungle garden metaphor. If the liberal order is like a garden, artificial and forever threatened by the forces of nature, preserving it requires a persistent, unending struggle against the vines and weeds that are constantly working to undermine it from within and overwhelm it from without. Today, there are signs all around us that the jungle is growing back. So what they're saying is that there's we've got these are the grandchildren of Leon Trotsky. In other words, the revolution is permanent. They are still world revolutionaries. What do you mean is against God about America? The liberal world order is against nature. It's against human nature. And it is also against the Creator. These are ultimately worshippers of Satan, servants of Satan, and they believe that, and they are the people who presently rule the United States. I realize it's very difficult for your average American to accept, but the USA has been the primary instrument of evil in the world since 1945. Possibly sooner, but definitely since then. So, let's see if we've got any more here. Dun, 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 dun. All right. What most critics and skeptics of American foreign policy today want is for the United States to act more like a normal nation. And it is true that for more than 7 decades, the United States has not been acting like a normal country. No, it hasn't, because it hasn't been, by his own admission, the United States has not been operating in the interest of Americans. No nation in history has ever been more deeply involved in the affairs of the world, nor accepted more responsibility for the state of humankind than the United States since the Second World War. Why? Because it hasn't been Americans. It hasn't been Americans making those decisions. Not for the most part. What you have here is the admission that American foreign policy has not been in the interest of America for 7 decades. So who has it been benefiting? It's been benefiting the people who are currently trying to preserve the liberal world order, the people who have been benefiting it, the people who have been running it, not Americans, for the most part. And I noted one more thing here. Now, this is what's kind of fascinating. This is where you can see where things went wrong. The success of the order, the liberal world order, however, also depended on the United States abiding by some basic rules. Chief among these was that it not exploit the system it dominated to gain lasting economic advantages at the expense of other powers in the order. Put simply, it could not use its military dominance to win the economic competition, and it could not use its economic position against other countries, against fellow members. It could not treat the economic competition as a zero-sum game and insist on always winning. So there you see where they went wrong. There you see where the de-dollarization began, because where they went wrong was when they insisted on sanctioning Russia in using the power of the US dollar and the power of the economic position of the United States against Russia. That's where they violated a principle that was required for the success of the order. Therefore, the order will fail. This is not something that can be rescued, because not only does Russia not trust them anymore, China doesn't, Indonesia doesn't, India doesn't, nobody does, because they understand that what's being done is not for their benefit, and they also understand that it's not even for the benefit of Americans. I was also reading on my other tablet. This is my workout tablet. I think I took some notes here too. Let me see. Yeah, I thought this was interesting because he's talking about the the failure of the Soviet system. Given that the Soviets had always insisted on holding themselves to the liberal world standards, and that Stalin and Khrushchev had promised to surpass the United States in various economic categories, these were demoralizing realities, the fact that the Soviets were not keeping up. The Soviet system was failing by its own measure. As one German historian has observed, the implosion of the Soviet bloc was a belated shattering of the illusions and self-deceptions that the leaders of the October Revolution had imposed on post-Tsarist Russia, and which thereafter had been believed by generations of communists the world over. Well, that's exactly what's happening now. That's exactly what's happening with the Neoclowns. They believed, and people who believed in the concept of the liberal world order, who believed in the inevitability of the end of history, who believed that democracy and freedom make wealth. All of these are lies. All of these are illusions and delusions that are just as false as the Soviet delusions and illusions, and the same result's going to happen. The liberal world order will fail because it is based on falsehood. Now, I did think that this was interesting here, an interesting observation here, because it's something that I've said many times. You've heard me say this many times. Gorbachev and it talks about the British, the end of the British Empire, and says they had it talks about the Germans and Japanese giving up their empires. It said they had all given up historic geopolitical ambitions in exchange for security, prosperity, and progress. Many Britons had regarded their centuries-old empire as part of their very identity as a people, and the loss of empire resonates even today. Yet Britons also took pride in their willingness to let it go. As one British historian has put it, the civilized acceptance of a post-imperial role was the great enduring triumph of British history since 1945. For a few years, it seemed Russia might do the same. They wanted to lift the Russian people's standard of living to something closer to their Western neighbors. To do that did not require an empire. In fact, it required jettisoning the empire. That's absolutely true. And it's true of the United States. If Americans want to return to some semblance of what America was, it has to give up the empire. The problem is that Americans don't run the empire. Jews run the empire. And so, it's difficult for Americans to make changes when they're not calling the shots. Now, the good news is that Kagan, despite being a literal card-carrying neoclown, appears to have some understanding that empire is not how you do it. Now, it's too bad his wife doesn't seem to understand it, because she's actively working on supporting the empire. But remember, even the most evil people often have halfway decent strategists. They just don't necessarily listen to them. You know. So I mean, he's trying to make sense of this stuff. He's also trying to, propagandize their position. But he is trying to explain what went wrong to his own masters and to his own team. And so dun, 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 dun. Now this is interesting because he's practically, I mean, unintentionally telling China what to do. In the end, the threat of Soviet communism proved manageable, just as Kennan had predicted. But this was not because it never represented a genuine threat. It was because the United States pursued a grand strategy of creating and defending a liberal order that constrained Soviet ambitions and exposed its weaknesses as an economy, as a society, and as a world power. That's exactly what China is doing. China has been methodically pursuing asymmetric next generation warfare, or what it calls unrestricted warfare. Asymmetric unrestricted warfare against the US empire. And so, I think that we can safely anticipate that we're going to see China continuing to play a long game. And in the same way that the United States was set up its empire to contain the Soviet Union and contain the Soviet system and eventually outlast it, I think that's exactly what China's planning to do. I don't think that China has any intention of invading Taiwan if it can avoid it. It might get into a shooting war. For example, if they're going to send the 400 anti-ship missiles to Taiwan, it would probably be smart for the Chinese to sink the ship that's carrying them. It would be better to get involved in a shooting war now rather than wait until Taiwan has been armed to the teeth, like Ukraine. But, the thing about war is that the other side gets a vote. The enemy always gets a vote. But it's pretty clear, because I guarantee you that all the Chinese strategists have read this book. I guarantee you that Xi Jinping has read reports that have analyzed what Kagan has written, as well as what all the other neoclowns have advised and so forth. I mean, they study this stuff more closely than the American or than the U.S. strategists study the Chinese stuff. But it is really fascinating. It was fascinating to see that Kissinger was openly admitting, that Kissinger was openly admitting the failure of the liberal world order. He was openly admitting that it was probably coming to an end. And this was not that long after the whole triumphalist thing of Fukuyama. And now to see that starting in 2019, they were already changing their metaphor and saying, yeah, it's not inevitable. In fact, it's going to require constant pruning and constant gardening. And oh, by the way, we're the gardeners. It's a totally different paradigm. And so, yeah, I mean, it is true that Ukraine demonstrates that the U.S. is not necessarily capable of burning back the jungle. We know that now. But it doesn't mean that they can't do it in other places. You know, could they do it in Mexico? Could they do it in Canada? Probably. You're still dealing with the most formidable military force on the planet. Just because it's nowhere near as powerful it was relative to other rivals as it was back in like 1990, doesn't mean that it's not powerful at all. You know, it's always important to not go overboard with your analyses, and not to underestimate things that might not be as strong as they were before, but they're still very, very strong. Anyhow, I will probably go into some more detail once I've finished the book and once I read one or two of the other books, but I just thought that this might be a useful perspective to keep in mind when you're following events taking place in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and now in Sudan and Djibouti and Ethiopia. So that's all I've got for tonight. I hope that was useful. And again, keep in mind we are working on solving the new shipping problem. I'll keep you posted. We'll have stuff on Social Galactic. And on that note, I'll let you go. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.